He had judged thousands before, but this performance stopped him cold. The Got Talent stage blazed under its familiar constellation of lights, blue and red spotlights cutting through the darkness. The massive golden logo gleamed above the judge's table, where Simon Cowell sat, arms crossed, expression unreadable. 22 seasons, and he'd seen everything, or so he thought. The audience buzzed with anticipation, phones raised, ready to capture the next viral moment. "Next up," announced the host, his voice booming across the theater, "we have Harold Winters, age 74, from Phoenix, Arizona." Simon's pen hovered over his notepad. 74. He'd learned to be cautious with older contestants. Sometimes brilliance surprised him, but often it was tragedy waiting to unfold on live television. The camera panned to him, catching that familiar mixture of skepticism and barely contained impatience that had made him famous. The curtains parted. Harold Winters shuffled onto the stage, wearing a pressed, but worn, navy suit, his silver hair combed back with military precision. In his weathered hands, he carried an old acoustic guitar, its wood-burnished golden brown, from decades of use. The spotlight found him, and for a moment he squinted against its glare. 800 faces stared back at him in the darkness beyond the lights. His fingers trembled, not with fear, Simon noted, but with something else, something deeper. Simon had seen every type of nervousness over the years. This was different. Harold's trembling wasn't anxiety about judgment. It was the weight of memory pressing against the present moment. "Hello there," called Amanda Holden, her voice warm. "What's your name, love?" "Harold Winters," he replied, his voice steady but quiet. "Though my friends back in Vietnam called me Hank." Vietnam. Simon's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The audience settled into a respectful quiet. "And what will you be performing for us tonight, Hank?" asked Alicia Dixon. Harold's grip tightened on his guitar. "I'm going to sing a song I wrote. It's called Coming Home to You. I wrote it for the boys who didn't make it back." The theater fell silent, not the artificial quiet of a pause in conversation, but the profound stillness that comes when hundreds of people simultaneously understand they're about to witness something sacred. Simon leaned forward slightly. He'd heard every sob story, every backstory designed to manipulate emotions. But there was something in the old man's voice, a steadiness that suggested this wasn't performance. This was truth. "Can you tell us a bit about the song?" pressed David Williams gently. Harold nodded, his eyes distant. "Lost 23 boys from my unit in '69. Good kids, all of them. Tommy Rodriguez was going to marry his girl when he got back. Billy Chen was saving up to buy his parents a house. Mark Sullivan had just found out he was going to be a father." His voice didn't break, but something in the silence that followed did. Simon felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "I made them a promise before we went on our last patrol," Harold continued. "Told them I'd make sure their stories got told. Took me 55 years to figure out how." He positioned the guitar against his body with practiced ease, his fingers finding the frets like they were greeting old friends. The opening chord rang out across the theater, simple, pure, heartbreaking in its honesty. Simon had his pen ready to make notes, his critical faculties engaged. But as Harold began to sing, something unprecedented happened. The pen stopped moving. The melody was nothing special, basic chord progressions, a simple rhythm. Harold's voice was worn, weathered by age, by every technical standard Simon used to judge performers. This was mediocre at best. But the words, "Tommy, you were just 19, had your whole life ahead, still hear your laugh in monsoon rain, still see your face instead." Each verse told a story with the specific details that only truth carries. Harold's voice cracked on the word sleep, and for the first time, his composure wavered. A tear escaped, rolling down his lined cheek, but he kept playing, kept singing, kept his promise to 23 ghosts. Simon felt something he hadn't experienced in 22 seasons of television. His throat was closing, his vision blurring. This wasn't entertainment. This wasn't even performance, really. This was a memorial service, a eulogy, a final roll call for the dead. Behind his carefully maintained facade, Simon was struggling with something he couldn't name. Harold wasn't trying to win anything. He was simply honoring a debt that most people would have forgotten decades ago. The song's final chord hung in the air like incense. Harold stood motionless, head bowed, as the last note faded into silence. The theater was tomb quiet. 800 people held their breath. The cameras kept rolling, capturing what would become one of the most shared moments in television history. But for now, there was only the sacred pause between ending and response. Simon tried to speak. Nothing came. He tried again, managing only a soft clearing of his throat that the microphones picked up. His hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. He began, then stopped. His eyes met Harold's across the stage, and in that moment, two men, one a global entertainment mogul, the other a forgotten veteran, shared an understanding that transcended words. The audience began to clap, tentatively at first, then with growing intensity. But Simon held up his hand, and somehow, miraculously, they fell silent again. "Harold," Simon said, his voice rougher than usual, "that song those boys you sang about." "Yes, sir. They were lucky to have you as their friend." Harold nodded, unable to speak. Simon stood. This had never happened before. Not once in 22 seasons had he left the judge's table during a performance review, but something larger than television protocol was at work here. He walked around the table, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The cameras followed him as he crossed the stage, his usual confident stride replaced by something more careful, more reverent. When he reached Harold, the old man looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much and carried too much for too long. Up close, Simon could see details the cameras couldn't capture: the small scar above Harold's left eyebrow, probably from shrapnel. The way his hands, despite their trembling, still held the guitar with absolute gentleness. The faded tattoo on his wrist, a unit insignia that had blurred with age but never disappeared. "How many people know their stories?" Simon asked quietly, his voice barely picked up by the stage microphones. "Just me now," Harold whispered. "I'm the last one left. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I can't remember if Tommy's eyes were brown or hazel. Billy's laugh is getting fainter every year. What happens when I'm gone? Who's going to remember that Mark used to carry his father's compass in his pocket?" The words hit Simon like physical blows. Here was a man who'd appointed himself the guardian of 23 lives that had ended too soon, and he was terrified that their memories would die with him. The weight of that responsibility, carrying not just the fact of their deaths, but the texture of their lives, the small details that made them real, was staggering. Simon nodded slowly. In that moment, he understood something that had never occurred to him before. Some burdens are too heavy for one person to carry alone, but too important to set down. Simon nodded slowly. Then, in a gesture that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform, he extended his hand to Harold. When the veteran clasped it, Simon placed his other hand over their joined hands and looked directly into the old man's eyes. "Not anymore," Simon said. "Tonight, 800 people know their stories. Tomorrow, millions will. They're not forgotten anymore, Harold. You kept your promise." Harold's composure finally broke. 55 years of carrying those names, those faces, those dreams that would never be fulfilled. It all poured out in great, shuddering sobs. Simon steadied him, one hand on his shoulder, and for a moment, the entertainment industry's most famously sharp-tongued critic became simply one human being, comforting another. The audience erupted. 800 people rose to their feet as one, applauding not for entertainment, not for talent in any conventional sense, but for sacrifice acknowledged, for stories told, for love that had traveled across decades to find its expression. Amanda wiped tears from her cheeks. Alessia held a tissue to her eyes. David stood with the rest, clapping with a reverence he'd never felt for any performance before. But Simon remained on stage with Harold, his hand still on the old man's shoulder, waiting for the emotional storm to pass. "I have one more thing to say," Simon announced, when the applause finally died down. His voice carried clearly now, strengthened by purpose. He turned to face the cameras directly, knowing that his words would reach far beyond this theater. Sometimes we get so caught up in looking for the next star, the next sensation, that we forget what real talent looks like. Tonight, Harold reminded us that the most powerful performances come from the heart. They come from truth. They come from love that refuses to die. He paused, gathering himself. To the families of Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Chen, Mark Sullivan, and all the other boys Harold sang about tonight, your sons, your brothers, your fathers weren't forgotten. This man has been carrying them with him for 55 years, and now, because of his courage, we're all carrying them too. The camera caught Harold's face, wonder and relief, and grief and gratitude all mixed together. The burden he'd carried alone for over half a century was suddenly shared by millions of strangers who would remember 23 names they'd never known before. "Harold," Simon said, turning back to him, "I want you to know something. In 22 years of judging performances, I've never heard anything more important than what you just shared with us. You didn't just sing a song tonight, you honored the dead. You kept faith with your brothers. You showed us what real courage looks like." The old man straightened, finding some echo of the soldier he'd once been. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. Simon nodded to the other judges, a silent communication that needed no words. 4 hands moved simultaneously to 4 buttons. 4 golden lights blazed to life, but it was Simon's voice that carried across the theater. "Harold Winters, you have 4 yeses, but more than that, you have our respect, you have our gratitude, and those 23 boys you sang about, they have something they never had before. They have witnesses to their lives, their dreams, their sacrifice." As Harold walked off stage, still carrying his guitar, still straight-shouldered despite his tears, the audience continued to clap. But it wasn't the explosive, excited applause that usually followed a golden buzzer moment. This was different, slower, more deliberate, more like a farewell salute. Simon returned to the judges' table, but he didn't sit immediately. He stood for a moment, looking out at the audience, then back at the empty stage where Harold had stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into his microphone, "sometimes television gives us something we didn't know we needed. Tonight was one of those times." The cameras captured it all, the tears still drying on Simon's cheeks, the profound quiet that had settled over the theater. Later, when the episode aired, that moment would break the internet. Remember, the 23 would trend worldwide. Harold's song would be downloaded millions of times, with proceeds going to veterans' charities. Tommy Rodriguez's niece would reach out, as would Mark Sullivan's son, a man who'd grown up wondering about the father he'd never met. But the impact went deeper than social media metrics. Veterans' hospitals reported a surge in volunteers. A documentary filmmaker reached out to Harold. Simon himself would quietly establish a scholarship fund for children of fallen veterans. Harold would receive thousands of letters from fellow veterans, many sharing their own stories of friends lost, promises made, memories carried. But that night, in the theater, none of that mattered. What mattered was that 23 young men who died in a jungle in 1969 had finally made it home. Their stories had been told, their names had been spoken, their dreams had been remembered. And Simon Cowell, who'd built a career on critique and skepticism, had learned that sometimes the most powerful performance isn't about technique or vocal range or star quality. Sometimes it's simply about one person loving another enough to carry their memory across decades until finally finding a way to share that burden with the world. As the show moved on to the next act, Simon found himself still thinking about Harold's weathered hands on that old guitar, still hearing the crack in his voice when he sang about coming home. For the first time in years, the judge had become the judged, measured not against ratings or demographics, but against the simple question, what do we owe those who've carried more than their share? The next performer took the stage, a young singer with big dreams. Technically proficient, commercially viable, exactly the kind of act that usually captured Simon's attention. But as she sang, Simon found his mind wandering back to Harold. During the commercial break, Simon stepped outside and called his assistant. "Get me Harold Winter's contact information," he said. "I want to make sure he gets home safely," and arrange for him to meet with veterans organizations. When he returned to the theater, the show was resuming. The lights came up, the cameras rolled, and Simon slipped back into his role as the sharp-tongued judge who'd made a career of crushing dreams and creating stars. But something fundamental had shifted. He'd been reminded that the most important performances often happen off-stage, in the quiet moments when one human being decides to honor another, when love refuses to be diminished by time or death, or the simple passage of years. That night, for 800 people in a theater, and millions more watching at home, the answer was clear. We owe them our attention. We owe them our respect. We owe them the promise that their stories won't die with the last person who remembers them. Harold Winters had kept his promise to 23 fallen soldiers. In return, the world made a promise to Harold. We will remember them too. The cameras would capture the tears, the standing ovation, the moment when entertainment became something more profound, but they couldn't capture the real magic of that night. The way Harold's courage to share his burden had given others permission to share theirs, the way one old man's love for his fallen friends had created a bridge across generations, connecting the living and the dead in an act of remembrance that would ripple outward long after the stage lights dimmed. In the end, that's what true talent really was, not the ability to hit high notes, or dance perfectly, or make people laugh, but the courage to love deeply enough that even death couldn't silence it. Harold had shown them all what that looked like, and none of them, especially Simon, would ever be quite the same.